everyone.
Hello.
Good evening. How is everyone doing?
Good.
Good, good. Well, my name is Ariel Levy, and I'm the co-chair of the Social Justice Advocacy Committee here at YWCA Cambridge. And I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight to our annual Stand Against Racism event. Founded by the YWCA Trenton and Princeton in 2007, Stand Against Racism is now a signature campaign of the YWCA USA. And this week, taking place all across the country in 44 states and DC, there are 750 sites participating in Stand Against Racism, which is pretty impressive, if I may say so myself. And I would like to just say that this campaign is designed to build community amongst those who work for racial justice, to raise awareness around the negative impact of institutional and structural racism. So Stand Against Racism is really one part of our larger national strategy to fulfill our mission of eliminating racism. But what does that even mean? What are we truly standing against tonight? And what do we hope that we'll be standing against for nights to come in the future? And we'll talk more about that later. How can we begin the process of eliminating racism and working towards social justice if we can't unite around a clear picture of what that really looks like here for us in our own community? And that's why we're here tonight. Cambridge is known for being a haven for progressive, educated, thoughtful individuals, organizations, and activists. So here in Cambridge, we also know that we're not immune to the multitude of challenges that are portrayed as happening somewhere else in the TV or on the news. Those issues are very much present here and are very much in need of being addressed in a real and thoughtful way. Luckily for us, we're fortunate to have a wealth of resources available to us. Some of those resources are here tonight as panelists for our discussion about what racism is, what it looks like in our community, and what we can do to fight against it. So I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator for donating their time, insight, and wisdom that they'll share with us tonight. I'd also like to give a shout out to the working group for your hard work on this event, to Eva and Anna for all of their hard work, their tireless efforts to make this happen, and to all of you for showing up. It's in participating in one of many, we hope, events of this nature that will bring together the Cambridge community to not just talk about racism and what's happening in our community, but to actively stand against it together. So I'd like to now introduce our moderator, Reverend Paul Robeson Ford, the senior pastor of Union Baptist Church in Cambridge. He comes to us from the Union Baptist Church, and before serving there, he was the senior pastor of the Avalon Park Community Church in Chicago. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Grinnell and a Master of Divinity from the Divinity School at University of Chicago. And right now, he's currently completing his PhD in theology at the University of Chicago, where his research interests focus on the intersection between prison ministry, mass incarceration, and theology that is centered on transformation and liberation. So thank you so much, Reverend Ford, for moderating tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sister Levy, and to my dear friends, Pastor Linda Jordan and Sister Eva, and Renee Gray, the chair of the board here, is one of our faithful members at Union. It's a real joy to be here tonight. Really grateful for the opportunity and the invitation to participate in an important conversation that needs to go on in Cambridge, just as it needs to go on all throughout this country. By way of introducing the panel discussion for tonight, and I do encourage you to read in greater detail the biographies of each of our panelists. I will mention them by name and organization in a moment. But by way of introducing the conversation tonight, I wanted to share with you a press release that was issued by the Cambridge Black Pastors Alliance, an alliance of churches primarily in the port, but also over on Western Avenue in the coast and other parts of Cambridge, that was put together and drafted early in this calendar year in the midst of not only the ongoing unrest that came out of Ferguson, but of course the assassination of 2 police officers in New York City, as we sought to grapple with the very sorts of issues that we're going to be delving into tonight. So let me just share this with you for just a moment. We have all been witness to a time of great tumult in the wake of Michael Brown's death at the hands of police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014. In the months since, the unrest has increased, fueled by the deaths of numerous other black men, women, and boys at the hands of police departments throughout America. Our hearts have been broken still further by the senseless killing of 2 New York City police officers. We affirm the sense of outrage at the apparent lack of accountability for law enforcement officials who take the life of another human being, oftentimes under ambiguous circumstances. We stand firm with the mission and purpose driving the Black Lives Matter campaign, and also affirm the grief at the loss of so many lives, both of law enforcement and of civilians. We believe that God is doing something in this season in history, and we all have a responsibility to discern how each of us can best participate using the tactics of nonviolence and leveraging the best traditions of democratic and open dialogue. We are grateful that Cambridge has largely been spared the deep fractures between police and the people they serve that has roiled so many communities around the nation. And yet, Cambridge is no stranger to social dysfunction that lies at the intersection of class, race, and law enforcement practices. We are the city that proved that an Ivy League professor can be arrested for trying to enter his own house while black. We are a city that boasts an enviously low murder rate, but the murders of black victims still go unsolved at a disproportionate level. We have been touched repeatedly in recent summers by violence that has taken the lives of our young people, despite being a city that is plush with wealth and saturated with resources. Cambridge has plenty of work to do. As pastors, we pray for our city fervently, and often we emerge from a time of collective meditation and reflection last fall, dedicated to seeking and proclaiming healing across the community. We began by blessing our municipal officials with breakfast at City Hall in the fall of this past year, and those efforts to be a blessing will continue in 2015. We believe that Cambridge can be a model for the nation of police-community relations that are marked by trust, accountability, and unity. Even in the wake of the controversy involving the aforementioned professor, the Cambridge Police Department instituted reforms that we are hopeful will prevent an incident like this from happening again. We pledge to do our part to make that happen and to be a partner in fostering relations between law enforcement and our neighbors that inspire confidence in all of us. And so as we celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., again issuing this in January of this year, we're mindful of the inescapable network of mutuality that calls us all to engage this work with urgency, determination, and faith. We know that the subject of racism goes well beyond the issues that were addressed in that press release, but we also, I think, are all painfully aware of the context that has pushed this conversation into the urgent space that it has been for some time now. And we know from recent examples around this country, Walter Scott down in the Carolinas and other recent events, that this issue is far from resolved, So we have a distinguished panel here tonight as we try to dig into what the dynamics look like in Cambridge. This is a unique situation and context in many ways, but there is still much work to do. We have all the way to the end here Sister Carla Nicholson, who is the Executive Director of the Haymarket People's Fund. And next to her, Brother Mo Barbosa, who is the Assistant Director of Training and Capacity Building, Health Resources and Action, a lifetime resident of Cambridge. Next to him, we have Sister Jennifer Yanko, who is a founding member of White People Challenging Racism. Sounds good. And we have Abe Latina, community activist and a friend of mine who has been very much involved in the Black Lives Matter campaign here in Cambridge. Next to him, we have Sister Shay Stewart Booley, who is the Executive Director of Community Change Incorporated. And last but most certainly not least, we have Sister Mary Gashaw, who is student activist and graduate class of 2017 will be, we're looking forward to that, Cambridge Ridgeland Latin High School, not too far from here. So again, I encourage you to consider their bios that are on the back here. We have a series of questions that we're going to explore, but those are really just guides. We really want to get to the meat of consideration here about the situation of racism in Cambridge and what we can do about it. And then in about an hour or so, we're going to wrap up the panel conversation so that we can open up to the floor here for questions and comments. So I'm going to start all the way down here to the end, where Sister Carla, our cameraman here, has asked you to either speak up loud or else we'll get you the mic, one way or the other, and just ask you to offer an initial reflection as to how you understand the term racism, what it is, what it means, right? And what do we need to think about in trying to address it?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. All right. First, I'll mention before I answer the question, Haymarket People's Fund is in its 41st year. We have been on over a 20-year journey in becoming an anti-racist organization. So we don't take the question or the definition of racism lightly. And even in coming up with a definition, it's built upon building blocks. You have to look at history and the understanding of how racism operates in this country, in the U.S. You have to look at culture. You have to take certain things into account. We believe at Haymarket that the definition of racism is race, prejudice, and power. I won't have an opportunity to go into detail to explain or to read the definitions of each of those words, but I think that it's really, really important to have an analysis that helps to create a foundation under the definition of what racism is. Racism is an ideology, it's a construct. It's something that was created, that was done to all of us. We all suffer because racism exists in this country. It's insidious. It permeates everything. And it's one of the topics that's least spoken about. People will talk about other isms very comfortably. They will avoid and escape the discussion of racism, which makes it even more prevalent. It lives and operates successfully because it's not taken apart or understood. If you ask a group of people, if we go around the room, you know the game of gossip. It's sort of like that. One person will say one thing in explaining how they understand and what racism is. You move to the next person and their understanding will be different. People will personalize it. Everything will happen but a process to undo it. So I'll just close with that point. The fact that you really need to have a full analysis to understand what racism is, and just simply a definition only begins to open up a can of worms in understanding how that system works.
Thank you, Carlos. So Mo, having lived in Cambridge your whole life and the work that you do now through this organization that you've been working with, can you talk about how this gossip game and the can of worms looks in the Cambridge situation?
Sure. So Cambridge is one of the places where I have to disclose that I came here as a 6-year-old. So not quite lifetime.
Not quite Canterbury, close to it.
It'll be in the Cambridge Day. Someone will stop me in front of Paul's later on and say, "You're not from Cambridge your whole life," so I want to make sure that we're clear. But in a loving and caring way, that will happen. People have deep traditions here. I want to talk about that can of worms because it's really important that we see how racism impacts our daily lives, impacts the people around us. One of the statistics that really knocked me over was the impact of racism on me as a black man. The outside feels really easy. Like I can name it. This person is scared of me. This person will not extend me the same services and opportunities that they would give someone else. This person will avoid me. Those things are easy to see. Some of the mental things, some of the ways that you experience people and their lack of expectations for you or what they perceive your possibilities are a little bit hidden. But even that is a little less insufferable. The part that I struggle with the most and the part where it shows up is that it has direct impacts on my health. one of the set of research that looked at the health of black men in the United States, their heart rate does not dip below the average heart rate for a white man in their sleep. So if you think about a white man in America, his heart rate is up here, and when he sleeps, he gets to a resting space. The average black man starts up here, an elevated rate, and gets down to where the regular rate for the white man is, and never gets to the resting place. And if you think about your heart as a system, as a motor, it's got a set of beats. Mine is going faster than someone else's, and I will suffer because of that. And that's across the board. That is a health effect of racism in this country. That's hard to put away. That's difficult to put away. It shows up in people's expectations of themselves. I was at the bank machine on, I don't know if it was yesterday or the day before. My card, you know when you're trying to get into the actual ATM, you haven't even stuck it in the machine. You just want to get inside. Would not go, would not go, would not go, would not go. This white brother comes up behind me and says, let me try. He pulls out his card, he puts it in, it doesn't work for him right away, then it works for him. So I have that moment of course it works for him. Ridiculous, right? That's a racism that I've been taught, right? And then I had that moment of like, wow, he wasn't scared to let me in. My expectation was that he wouldn't have done that. That's a racism that I've been taught as well. So we've got to be able to challenge some of the things that live within us. I think about how often I sit on the MBTA, which is often, and how I almost always have an empty seat next to me. I get to enjoy and luxuriate on the MBTA while others crowd around me holding on, because that open seat will stay open until somebody says, I just have to sit down today. My reveling in having an open seat, that's racism that I've been taught. That's something I've internalized. My willingness to use people's perception of me to my advantage, that's racism that I've been taught. So that lives there too, and it has to be undone as much as the really visible kind and the kinds that I talked about before. But it can't be seen to be so overpowering. I think about racism as a cloak for something else. There's a competition for resources. There's a people want the same things and perceive the other as somebody who would not allow them to have that resource. And so they use racism as a guise for why not you. So I don't want you to live in this neighborhood. I don't want you to go to these schools. I don't want you to have access to these resources. Not so much because I don't think you should have them, but I don't want to have to compete for them myself. And so I see that as the under-analysis behind some of why we have the kinds of conflict around race that we have. It allows me to not hate the racist, and that's a really important part because it's racism that we're all being taught. And if we start at the point where we hate the racist, we never really address the racism. And so that's the space. If there's anything I would say to the YWCA, keep on the fight of ending racism and invite and enjoy and celebrate the folks, because we're all imperfect in dealing with the racism that we all have been taught and we all are suffering from. Last thing I'll mention is that there's a space for racism to be done, to be undone in Cambridge in a way that many other cities don't have. I'm glad you brought up the police. Part of our challenge is that in other places, they really see the police as somebody else coming into that community. We have the opportunity in Cambridge to have the police be who we want them to be. That's a very different reality, and that's based on how our community has been. Not everybody is there with me yet, but I believe that we can make the relationship between police and community something really different than what other communities experience, because we've been creating community in Cambridge for all of my lifetime and all of the stories before my lifetime almost my lifetime here.
Almost.
Almost my lifetime here. So there are different ways. So that if there's a kernel of hope for some of those things, it's that could happen. I said it was the last thing, but I want to just mention one more thing. I chair the Men of Color Task Force, and we keep talking about how what we've always been talking about the last 20-something years about the disproportionate death of men of color and black men at the hands of police and vigilantes or whatever, it's just on TV now. It's not a higher rate. It has been going on, and we've been talking and thinking and crying about it forever. So I want to invite folks to stay in the conversation after it no longer is on TV.
Thank you, Mo. I'm going to skip over here to the end and then come back in towards the middle. Mary, hearing, Mo kind of put a couple of additional pieces out there in terms of the can of worms. One, the idea that there's a deeper analysis that has to go on in terms of how, some would say kind of capitalism plays into this analysis, race and the economy, to this notion that relationships and not allowing this veil of racism to make relationships impossible, that's going to be key as we look at this. Coming out of your context as a high school student in Cambridge, how is the subject of racism being taught or not taught in your context at Cambridge Regional Latin? And two, how do you see it impacting relationships with your peers as well as with teachers, administrators, things of that nature?
Okay. So Cambridge, we like to think that we're perfect, that we have no issues, that, as you said, that we're utopia. And because of that, that's prevented a lot of conversations about racism from happening. And so after the Michael Brown indictment, we had to walk out at our school, and that helped spark a conversation about racism. But from that point forward, it's very difficult to talk about racism because you have teachers who don't actually know what racism is. And when you have teachers who don't know what racism is, trying to have these conversations with the students about racism, you pretty much get nowhere. And something that a lot of the youth organizations that I'm a part of like to do is use storytelling in the work that we do to make what we're saying real, to make racism, which is a very abstract, very difficult thing to understand, something more tangible. And since teachers and other people in the community haven't had that training, haven't had the workshop experience to really have conversations about racism, is difficult. And the way it's being taught isn't that great. And also, a lot of the teachers at CRLS happen to be white. And for me, as a student of color, having someone who is white telling me what racism is very difficult compared to having a person of color telling me what racism is. And I think that CRLS is a school that has 60% students of color. It's important that the people who are teaching us these things reflect who we are as people. Even though racism is this social construct, we need to also understand that it's something we breathe in every day, and it's something that has become real in the society. And then your second part was the impact.
On relationships, between you and peers and you and teachers, administrators, things of that.
I feel like at school I've been known as the angry black woman for what I've been doing regarding racism, anti-racism work. And it's very difficult to have conversations because you don't know the other person's experience. You don't know the racial experiences that they have that have made them want to say certain things or do certain things that have made you question. And so something that I like to do a lot is speak up whenever I see something wrong that's happening, even though I don't know that person well, and to befriend them. And I think dialogue is very important, but also action. And I think that racism, through conversations about racism and how we can actively work together across our colors, our skin color, is very important, and that's something I try to do a lot, is just have a dialogue, because even though if the other person doesn't want to have the dialogue, just try to build that relationship to the point where they can have a dialogue, and you can show them how messed up this world is in regards to race.
Good. Ms. Jennifer, Mary said something which strikes me, this whole issue of how or who should be teaching who about racism. and how challenging it is to receive white people trying to teach people of color about racism. What do you think the role is that white people have to play in the dialogue and the conversation around race and racism?
Let me first respond to a thought I had while you were
Sure.
talking. You were saying you're seen as the angry black woman. And it's interesting because when I, as a white woman, talk about racism and confront people.
Speak up, please.
Okay, I was saying it's interesting. She's saying that she's regarded as the angry black woman when she calls out racism. But as a white woman, when I call out racism, I'm either considered a kook or very courageous. And we're saying probably similar things. But that was not what you were asking. You were asking what you think the role of white people is in dismantling racism. And I think that I'm speaking largely from my perspective as someone who is one of the group, White People Challenging Racism, moving from talk to action. And I think that I could say that our group was really formulated sort of in response to Malcolm X's injunction that we go work with our own communities. So I think that's a place where we can leverage our privilege in that we have the ear of other white people, not always, but more likely, and we can, we are white, we have that experience, so we can share where we've come and how we see things, and so I think that that's where our strongest role is to really be going out and doing the work of meeting with members of our own communities.
Okay, very good. Abe, I've heard you speak in some other circles about your understanding of the privilege that you understand white people to not have to think or talk about race if they don't want to. This is one of the fundamental aspects of white privilege, and so of course you have that privilege and could have fully taken advantage of that, as some would argue many white people do. So what is it that led you to forego that privilege and to get into what is at the very least a fraught conversation with some of the dynamics that were just mentioned here in the past few comments?
Yeah, it's definitely true that I got to go through most of my life not having to talk about race. Louder? Okay. Why did I decide to forgo that? I think I was raised in a house of Democrats, Democrats who wanted to talk about politics and injustice and all the stuff that good Democrats who care about injustice talk about. And at the same time, we didn't really talk critically about race. So we talked in broad strokes about justice. So I grew up always with the sense that there is injustice, and I never forgot that. But I didn't have the tools for actually looking at how I individually played a role in that. And so I realized that there were two parts of me that couldn't coexist. I can look back and see they couldn't coexist. There's the part of me that deeply understands that injustice exists, even if I haven't had to personally experience it. I've witnessed a little bit of it, but I've never experienced it. I know it's there, but at the same time, what am I supposed to do about it? And I was taught that there were individualistic solutions, that it's how I behave. If I am, so I wasn't directly taught this, but I absorbed this idea that if I am nice to black people, if I give money to the poor, if I make sure not to disrespect people, that's how to overcome how to overcome racism. That way I'm not playing a role in racism or other isms. And what I learned to see through very patient conversations, people being very patient with me, both people of color and white people, through many, many conversations and people telling me to read books and me following their advice, I learned to see that I had been born into complicity, into something that I was taught that I understood. And this is when Carla used the word insidious. I feel like it's the best word I've heard about how to describe it. because I was taught that I did understand racism. And so therefore, and I knew the solution to it, which was to not be racist. So insidious in that it's almost like the Matrix. I think I understand, and in fact, the world is upside down. That me seeking out individual solutions to racism, how can I just fix myself and make sure I don't say the wrong thing? Dispersing all the energy that I have, that I want to put towards justice, dispersing it towards a solution that solves nothing because it ignores institutional and systemic racism. So I learned to see that this is my life that is being impacted. I am living a lie. So now I was brought up with the moral reasoning for ending racism. Very strong moral arguments for why should we end racism. And I was convinced, and I am convinced of the moral reasons. But when I started to see beyond the moral reasons, me living a lie, the lie of white supremacy, and me seeing that I've been brought up with that so deeply ingrained in me, that is not who I want to be. And yet here I was born into servitude to that. And the servitude is put in the form of material and social comfort. So it's so insidious that it's couched in this in comfort that it, I think, ignores spiritual and interpersonal. I was brought up spiritually and socially in terms of interpersonal, impoverished, because I didn't know even how to talk to people who were different than me. I didn't know how to talk to black people, because I knew that something about the way that I was approaching life was that there was this body under the table, as James Baldwin says. There's a body under the table. We both know it's there, and if we can't talk about it, it's soon we can't talk about anything. And I think that describes the way I saw that I was living. And so I started to see that beyond the moral arguments, it is my life that is incomplete. It is my ability to connect with people that is restricted to an incredibly narrow band of humanity. And so I still trumpet the moral arguments, but what I'm interested is exploring beyond the moral arguments, where are the white people who are on the border of making a leap? Because to me it's a leap. You can't kind of decide, okay, I guess I see white supremacy and I'm sometimes going to work against it. It's a leap. And so I'm interested in exploring with other white people beyond the moral arguments, because you've seen the statistics, you've seen the news articles, there's nothing missing. What is it that it will take to get you to make a leap? And I'm trying to explore my own process. I'm still leaping. I haven't gotten there. I'm still leaping. But that's why I decided to forgo that privilege, as you mentioned, of not talking about race.
Oh, thank you. I want to put a pin in this white supremacy piece and ask all of you in a minute. I want to get Sister Shane here, but first, but when we come back to it in a minute, to talk about this issue of white supremacy. It's a loaded term, but it's one that you're going to run into very quickly in these conversations, and what the relationship is between white supremacy and racism. Okay, what the relationship is between white supremacy and racism. And Sister Shay, as I was looking at this biography of the work that you do with community change, a couple of things certainly stick out to me. First of all, that you were a black girl in Maine. That's one.
Who was originally from Chicago.
Who was originally from Chicago, my goodness. Two, in light of what Sister Jennifer was saying earlier, that she took as kind of her impetus for the work that she does, Malcolm X's kind of directive, to white people who wanted to get involved, basically go deal with your own people. We're going to deal with our folks. And then I see the description of this organization having a specific focus on working with white people. And here you are as the executive director of this organization. And so I'm interested to hear a bit more about how all of that lays out for you, and in the context of these different ways that one can look at it. There is an analysis that says that there is plenty enough for each of us to deal with in our own communities, to find in certain ways that we need to deal with first before crossing into other communities to deal with this issue. So,
You said a lot there.
I know. So you can
just
take any
stayed-
of it, take any of it,
no
and
problem.
go.
And,
I'm trying to get you in
and
here.
you're a preacher too, and I'm a PK, so I felt like you did that PK spin, where it's like, what did he just say to me? Anyway, yes, my biography. I'm a Chicago native. I lived in Chicago for the first 30 years of my life, and then 13 years ago I moved to Maine. When I moved to Maine, I started talking about race, because in case you're not aware, Maine is about 100 miles or so, a little less than that actually, away from Boston, but it's like night and day in terms of the lack of diversity there, and I had to move there for personal reasons. So it wasn't an option, and just in the first 2 years there alone, it felt like I had just entered a rabbit hole in a new reality. And so I started writing about race. I did an undergraduate degree in African American Studies, so I had some context to write about race. But long story short, about 7 or 8 years ago, I started a blog called Black Girl in Maine. The blog is somewhat known in various circles. There's some recent incidents that happened nationally to my family that made the national news. Somehow over the years, as I was writing the blog, I really got interested in working with white people around racism, which is part of how I ended up at Community Change, which is interesting. I am the first non-white executive director of a 47-year-old organization that deals with anti-racism work, racial equity, and working with white people. And it's been an interesting journey. I've been in this position now since January of 2014. And let me say, it's definitely been a shift for all of us. I think for myself, my staff, my board, and our constituency. What does it mean for our work when there is a person of color now leading the organization? Our mission still remains the same, which is to work with white people to get white people to sort of understand that racism, as we define it at CCI, is a white problem. And that definition of racism was taken from the Kerner Commission report that was issued in 1968, that after the 1967 Detroit race riots, when that commission convened to figure out what to do with all these, rowdy black people, came back and said, wait, it wasn't the black people, it's the white people, it's the systems that we've set up. Our founder is 92 years old, and he still lives and dies on that definition. And our work over the years has been education and mobilization of white people. I know that Jennifer's group has had some connections over the years through CCI and a deep connection. So that's one of the many ways that the tentacles of CCI sort of reach out and do other things within the larger white community. I think the biggest way that my being not white impacts the work is that honestly, I feel like we've spent a lot of time for 47 years talking about racism and not doing enough about racism. I'm going to be honest, in progressive liberal spaces like this, I think that white people have a tendency to other themselves, particularly when the intersection of class and race. It becomes real easy for upper middle class and above white people to go, we're not like those white people. And so the conversations become circular because we're not like the guy in Appalachia or the guy up in northern Maine. And therefore, the work never really moves. We end up having what I call the circle jerk of feel good, but we aren't creating change.
Wow.
And that's honestly how I feel about it. And in my role as ED, there's been a lot more sort of calling out things, because one of the observations I've had in my year plus time is that I've been in spaces with white activists who can tell us these amazing analyses, but when confronted with a real life issue of racism or an inappropriate word, nobody knows how to speak up. Everybody freezes. So my role, I would like to say, is to sort of gently push people into being uncomfortable. Because when we talk about racism, I want you to be uncomfortable. Because as Brother Mo over here talked about black men, but my undergraduate work at DePaul in Chicago specifically focused on health disparities. And now that I'm middle-aged, I can absolutely, for a fact, say there's no mistake in the fact that by the time black people get to middle age, we start having health problems. And I feel like that's the cumulative effects of living with racism. If you probably were to ask every black person specifically in this room, do you or somebody close to you have high blood pressure, or are you on the brink of high blood pressure? We could probably all raise our hands. That's what racism does to us, because we stuff it down and we live with it. So for white people, I want you to get a little uncomfortable too. Maybe your blood pressure needs to go up just a little bit as well. And maybe at that point, that is when we will actually really do the hard work of dismantling these systems. Because at the moment, the systems are people, and we need to reach the people. And my job is to help facilitate that process and guide white people to getting to that point. Based off my own lived experiences, someone from the Midwest who's now in New England.
I am scared of you. Woo! Jesus. Oh, Lord. Everybody take a deep breath. Exhale. Sister Carla, I want to go all the way back down to you now because you talked about the fact that you had some very particular definitions in terms of prejudice and power, and you didn't want to go into it, but I'm going to give you an opportunity now under the guise of this conversation about white supremacy, and perhaps the definition of white supremacy. What role does white supremacy play, or should it play, in a conversation and a diagram, so to speak, and an action plan around racism?
Okay. I think that just like the term race, racism, racist shuts down conversations, white supremacy does the same thing. But that can't stop us from really unpeeling that onion because we don't have an option.
Right.
As you've heard from this panel tonight, it's vicious, it's vile, it's intense. We've got to look at it. So let's look at that word white supremacy and think about how we unpack it. As a white person who is in the world today in America, there's no question that there's unearned power and privilege that goes along with that. To the extent that a white person doesn't have to think about being white. As a black woman, my life is dependent on my remembering and my understanding and my looking over my shoulder and my second guessing and my working that much harder to be better, to be stronger, to be, to really be in command of everything. Every word I say, everything I write will be questioned. But as a white person, it's just the polar opposite. It never has to be thought about. Even the term white. I can hardly go through a day without having to identify or classify myself. But a white person doesn't have to do that. Likewise, I can't move in the world as an individual. Once again, it is a safety issue. I have to have people that have my back, whether they're visibly there or whether I can call on them when I need them. So individualism is something that is a part of white supremacy. If you're individuals, you'll never work together as a collective to actually accomplish something. That's how this whole system is devised. So we really have to understand and dig deeper and deeper to understand exactly what's going on, and not just simply revel in the benefits from that. Another effect of white supremacy is the internalized manifestations that occur. Those have to be dealt with. There's a wonderful article called Challenging White Supremacy, where you really look at and pick apart and really deal with the impacts of what it means to be white. And Kenneth Jones, who's now an ancestor, and Tim O'Hoon jointly worked on this particular piece. It is a wonderful tool that I'd love to share with everyone here, where you look at things like language, you look at things like interactions, and you really go deeper, understanding what the dynamic is that's going on. Because you can often be in a room, say at a meeting, and something happens, and you say, wait a minute, something went down, there was some dynamic there, I can't name it, but I feel really grimy, something's wrong, something's really, really wrong. This particular process, looking at challenging white supremacy, really helps to explain what some of that is. Looking at not just quality, but not just quantity, because everything is counted. Widgets are counted. If you can't count it, it doesn't have a value in this society. But we need to look at the stories, as our sister Mary was saying. We need to really look at the quantity, not just the quality. So there are many, many terms. But what I'll wrap up in saying is that understanding, educating ourselves about what's going on around this system is critical, so that we can then look at the other side and what we're going to do about it. And what has happened because of white supremacy is white people have sold their souls in order to get power and privilege. And it's not worth it. And so by understanding the system and how it works, and not just talking about white supremacy, but learning how to challenge it and just dismantle it, is the only way that that humanity will be regained. And that has an effect on everybody.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, I want to ask you this question, though, in working with it, because Carla threw this out there and define white supremacy in some ways that really emphasize the notion of supremacy, of unearned privilege, but also preface it with saying, hey, look, you think race and racism shuts down a conversation, throw the phrase white supremacy out there. How do you have this conversation in a context with white folks who grew up lower class, who may have grown up trailer park, may have grown up with the perceived lack of real opportunities, good jobs, privileges, that sort of situation? How does a conversation about white supremacy or racism go anywhere with a group of people who have plenty of things they can point to say, how do you call me privileged? I'm poor. I don't have a good job, no money in my family. How does that conversation get had in a situation like that, where this intersection of class and race that Mo brought up plays out a little bit differently in some nuanced ways than we might sometimes think?
I think that intersectionality is very, very, very important, and that white privilege is not a